Did I see here?
Yeah.
What is it? Hotel pin.
Sorry? No. Do you know? So the Meet Echo stuff, we just logged in, so we just keep it open like that.
Yeah, don't touch that. That'll just work.
Oh, they'll just work?
Yeah, you don't do anything to this.
Oh, so I should just close browsers, things, don't do anything?
I don't know. I don't honestly. I don't. What state was it in when you got here?
Just nothing.
Oh well.
Oh.
All you have to do. This is your user interface right here, and it's great. It's covered. It's awesome.
Okay.
Have you used it? Yeah, it's awesome. It's actually what right here. It's like I know. Whoa. That's what happens when I press big red button. It can make people talk and make them.
You should have gotten a dialogue in your browser asking you.
Hi.
I did that.
This is for the queue.
Okay, but okay, so how do I see it? Because there was nothing on.
You can see the meeting room.
Okay, but this one was projecting to that screen.
It was and this for the queue. Right.
But what do we need to do? So it was empty. I can close everything. Oh, you will do. Okay. Oh, okay. I wasn't aware. Okay. Yeah, I didn't know what. Okay.
Just when someone joined the queue.
I put it on mute though. Should I unmute it?
No. It's fine. When someone is in queue, you can unmute the first of the queue, pressing the big red button. To unmute and grant the next user in the queue.
Okay.
Repress.
And the queue I will see there.
Yes, you will see there, and the audience will see in.
Okay. So the first thing is unmute first in the queue, mute, and then how do you set the second in the queue?
Sì, ho fatto davanti con C, tu mi hai detto che si vedeva. Ok, allora torno di là. Comunque vi rimetto le video della cosa che sta succedendo. Tempo di arrivare. Ok. We can mess around with that because you press it once and you press it the second time you unmute it and then you press it. The first, each press is unmute. If it's the unmute, the next. If it's the last, it's the final unmute. Okay, I go.
Yeah, you want to start? Ja, ik heb ze hier. Misschien doe ik jou iets eerder, dat we even de presentaties omdraaien, omdat we gezeik hebben met remote. Oké. Hello everyone, welcome to the Human Rights Protocol Considerations research group in the IETF. Great you're all here. I assume you can all hear me, so that's great. Here are some administrivia where you can follow and join the work, as well as the Meet Echo link where the slides will also be seen. I just heard we might have some minor issues with Meet Echo, but I fully trust that the people are working on it, so that will be okay. And we'll see when we go further down the agenda where we're going into something, because we have 3 remote presentations today. We have quite a full agenda, but one presentation, that one of Jeffrey Bowker, got cancelled because Jeffrey is sick, so he might come back for the Berlin session. He excused himself to everyone here. So first I'd like to ask, is there someone who would like to take notes? Maybe someone who is very experienced in HRPC note-taking. DKG. Thank you. And a Jira scribe. Who will be willing to be a Jira scribe? It's not much. Slide numbers. I know you are all burning with desire to do it, but you're just shy. Mark.
I'll do it.
Great, Olaf. Thank you so much. Saved by the bell there. You owe him a beer. Are there any additions changing to the agenda? No. In that case, we'll be going on to the note well that you all probably know and have noted well.
Yeah.
So I'll start off with a short overview of the status of the research group. There's a mistake in this slide because we're no longer a proposed research group, because in December 2015 this research group got chartered. We've been running with this proposed research group since January 2015. And we are now, we have been holding sessions since IETF 92. We have been consistently holding sessions at every IETF, and now we are here at IETF 95 with a new session, a new research draft, an updated report draft, and a censorship draft, as well as 2 presentations. So the context of the research is that it is widely seen that the internet is a tool of freedom of expression and freedom of association. But it becomes more and more important to understand, is this by intention or by coincidence? And as the scale and industrialization of the internet has grown, the influence of different worldviews compete with other values. And also in RFC 3935, it is recognized that the internet isn't value neutral, and neither is the IETF. So I'd like to understand what is the impact of internet protocol and human rights and vice versa, and how can we make the choices more explicit and understand the relation better. So what the research group aims to do is to expose the relation between protocols and human rights, and to propose guidelines to protect the internet as a human rights enabling environment in future protocol development. To make this topic also more accessible for people who are not necessarily going to every IETF, we created a website, hrpc.io, which introduces the work, gives a overview of the drafts, and also the film that has been screened at last IETF, Net of Rights, can be seen there. And after every IETF or intermediary meeting, we'll also put on short reports there, some links. You can also see the mailing list traffic there to give people a low barrier of entry and more accessibility to the work. So that were the administrivia at the beginning. Avri, did I forget anything? So in that case, I would like to now hand over to the first presentation by Ramzi Nasser. Ramzi, are you in the queue? Could you add yourself to the queue, Ramzi? So in that case, I can unmute you so you can give your presentation.
I don't see a hand.
Oh, that's great. Is that you, Ramzi?
Yeah, if you see a person in a blue shirt and headset, that's me.
Yeah, we see you and we hear you. So go
Excellent.
ahead and please indicate when I should go to the next slide.
Cool, will do. Yeah, so I guess just go ahead to the next slide and I could get started. Yeah, if you'll just advance to the next slide. This is, yeah, there we go. So, hello everyone. My name is Ramzi Nasser. I want to say that this is a big honor to address you at this meeting, and very exciting to me that the topic that I'm going to talk about today is being taken as seriously as it is, which just hasn't been the case in the past. So this is my website. Everything I'm talking about today, and my other work is visible there. If you advance to the next slide, you'll see my Twitter handle. If that's your thing, you can follow me on Twitter. I tend to talk about this kind of stuff a lot there as well. So what I want to do today is I want to give you all a brief introduction about who I am and the sort of perspective that I have, and talk to you about a project that I built that I think is pertinent to the idea of human rights in protocol design and in computation in general. If you'll advance to the next slide, Niels. So I'm a computer scientist. I studied computer science at the American University of Beirut in Lebanon, which is my home country. And that experience was interesting because instruction was all done in English, although it was, an Arabic-speaking country in an Arabic-speaking city. So some people ask me, where I thought of the perspective that I have on certain things, and it really wasn't a choice. It's just the nature of being an Arabic-speaking computer scientist. This is, you're confronted with the duality of these two worlds, whether you like it or not. So my focus in undergrad was graphics, which is not super important. If you advance to the next slide, when I came to graduate school in New York at the Parsons School of Design, I began teaching programming, games programming and graphics programming, using tools like processing and open frameworks in languages like Java and C++. And I began thinking about teachable languages there, and how do you make a programming language more teachable to someone who doesn't necessarily have a computer science degree. A lot of my classmates and the people that I was interacting with were artists who were very talented and very intelligent, but didn't necessarily, study computer science in the same way that I did. So it's the question of teachable languages that got me thinking about programming language theory. And if you'll advance to the next slide, out of grad school, I was fortunate enough to be granted a fellowship at the IBM Art and Technology Center in Chelsea, in New York. And I began to do a much deeper exploration of teachable programming languages. And I did a lot of work there. A lot of it revolved around the semantics of programming. I did a lot of focus on live coding and how a relationship with a computer could be more of a conversation as opposed to type a bunch of code and hope it works kind of relationship. But part of the question of how do you make a teachable programming language is people talk a lot about the text of the code that you write and how do you make it more intuitive. And because of my experience as an Arabic speaker, the notion of intuitive programming languages was never quite lined up with what a lot of the prevailing thought was. And the observation that I made was that all programming without exception, is done in American English, meaning that the letters that you use, the characters that you use, and the words that those make up the basic keywords and standard libraries of all programming, without exception, everywhere in the world, is done in a single. It's based on a single written culture, and if there's any hope of a universal, global, teachable programming environment, that is something that would have to be addressed. And that is how at IBEAM I found myself, if you'll advance to the next slide, working on a project that explored that exact idea of the importance of the natural language that your coding tool is based on. So I built a programming language called Elb. I pronounce it Elb because I'm Lebanese. The classical Arabic pronunciation would be Qalb. Gulb is how they might say it in the Gulf. It's an acronym. It's a recursive acronym, which is a very nerdy in-joke among programmers. But it basically translates to, the word means heart or core. And the full name is Elb Lughat Barmajeh, and that translates to heart, a programming language. So, like I said, the question of the importance of the natural language that your coding language is based on is what I'm trying to explore. And if you'll advance to the next slide, you'll see the first sample of what the language itself looks like. So this is a screenshot taken from the interpreter, which is available online. The link is on my website. It's read from right to left, of course. It is a member of the Lisp family, for those of you with programming experience or background. I did this because artistically I was exploring the history of and the traditions of computer scientists and Arabs, and both communities have very strong relationships with the text that they manipulate. And Lisp as a language family is a very old one, and it's a language family steeped in a lot of tradition and mythology even. So there's artistic reasons for choosing that, but it's also Lisp languages are very easy to implement. They're all inside of parentheses, and parsing them is quite simple. And part of what I think makes this language interesting is it's actually a very boring programming language. It doesn't do anything new by design. The only thing that it does is it just happens to be in Arabic. If you'll advance to the next slide, there is one kind of fun thing that comes out of that, which is because Arabic is a cursive script, you can elongate words arbitrarily. So the parser in Elb is set up to recognize elongated words as all being the same. So this is me, I'm printing out the phrase hello in each line, and you can see that the keyword kul, which means to say, or in this case to print, you'll see that it gets longer and longer on each line, but the behavior is the same. So this is the only sort of novelty that comes out of the fact that the language itself is based on Arabic. If you'll advance to the next slide, it's important to stress that this is not an exercise in speculative design or design fiction. It is a real functioning programming language. It's Turing complete. And this is an implementation of the Fibonacci algorithm. You see, I calculate the Fibonacci of 10, and the result is 55. If there are any Arabic speakers watching, and making it as a sort of, as opposed to a sketch, but actually going out and engineering this and building it is, I think, what has yielded the sort of somewhat unsettling conclusions that I've reached as a result of this project. If you'll advance to the next slide, I'll show you a couple of screenshots of the biggest code base that I've written in Elb. This is a part of the source code to a game of Pong that I made for the Baby Castles Art Gallery here in New York City. This is the function that is setting up the draw loop. If you advance to the next slide, you'll see the initialization code. Part of the provocation is just seeing this sort of script out of place, so to speak. I try and make it a point of making that as visible as possible. But so it does work, and it's a real language. And the reason that I insisted on going all the way to having a Turing complete programming language, if you'll advance to the next slide, is to begin asking the question of, okay, what actually breaks? if you just make a single decision, which is to not base the script on English, but to base it on something like Arabic, and make English characters a syntax error, which they are in Elb, what actually happens? So intuitively, I felt that, oh, things would probably break, but I wanted to be a little bit more formal about that. And here we see this is still the name of the GitHub repository till today. It's 3 dashes. Because GitHub repository names are ASCII only, it turned out. I didn't know that. If you'll advance to the next slide, you'll see a diff, a git diff for my terminal. It's completely useless. So this is somewhere in the terminal emulator or the Git client itself. There's some assumption about encoding that does not include Arabic, so that this is an unreadable diff. If you'll advance to the next slide, you'll also see. It's a little heartbreaking. Elb till today has to use English language file names because the Arabic file names, especially when they're hosted on the web, they just cause problems that I wasn't able to solve in time for my IBM fellowship. It's something that I've been wanting to revisit. But I'm trying to print out the names of files and folders, and it's just completely useless. If you advance to the next slide, you'll see an early version of Elb running in Safari, and that's just what the first printout happened to do. If you'll advance to the next slide, I'll talk about what I think all of this means. And it felt like engineering performance art to an extent, to sort of push through this and insist on the keeping the character set restricted to Arabic symbols. I found that some systems are ASCII only in that they will actually reject any character outside of the ASCII the ASCII code page, and some are a little better, but not a whole lot better, where ASCII is the default. So you actually have to do additional work to get anything besides ASCII to function. To write any code in Elb, I actually use 3 different text editors. None of them render Arabic correctly, but they all are broken in different ways that overlap enough that I can get what I need to do done. Let's do this. So I've also found that Elb has been almost like a truffle swine for character encoding assumptions. And it's been included in digital documentaries where the mere mentioning of its name, or the mere insertion of its name into a database, has caused crashes and all kinds of failures. Again, the only thing that's unique about this language is that it is not based on ASCII. And just making that singular decision triggers all these catastrophes. And this is, if you'll advance to the next slide, I'll quickly move through what I think, where this comes from. And unfortunately, I wish I had suggestions. I wish I had solutions to present to you all, but I really don't. I only have questions and observations. And I've seen that basically text is hard. And I think this is a perspective that not a lot of engineers have. But when you're talking about text, you're talking about encoding the written human language, which is this enormously complex and non-standard, non-elegant thing that different people do at different times in history, in different ways on different continents. This is a huge problem, right? But text gets talked about as this, it's just text. There's no perception of recording text as this very difficult thing. And as a result, assumptions about it are everywhere, at every level of the stack. If you advance to the next slide, what that basically tends to mean is that ASCII is actually everywhere. There's this single encoding that we've settled on that really rules everything for all intents and purposes. Unicode can exist at the content layer sometimes. Even that is broken in many ways. But the only text that's guaranteed to work 100% of the time is ASCII, which encodes Latin characters and was designed for English. If you advance to the next slide, this is the sort of human rights implications start to show up with this sort of feeling that I get from a lot of people is when they talk about plain text, something is encoded as plain text, that tends to mean ASCII, and that's actually, as a native Arabic speaker, that starts to become politically problematic to me. If you advance to the next slide, I'm getting a comment in the chat that says Arabic text seems to be working my terminal shell just fine. If you can paste a screenshot, I can almost guarantee you that it's going to look like what my next slide is going to look like, which is not actually Arabic. So the extreme sort of like conclusion of that is on the internet and in computation, because of our reliance on ASCII and because of the sort of equating of ASCII with plain text, again, on every level of the stack, this is where I feel that the world of software is today. That all of human writing has been collapsed into one particular encoding for American English. And that's no good. If we're talking about the internet and computation as being an empowering, democratizing, global tool and platform, this is not enough. And I don't say this to shake my fist or to point fingers. This is just the reality. This is just where we find ourselves. These are observations that I've made outside of just programming. If you'll advance to the next slide, this is a screenshot from one of my favorite games called Threes. I'm trying to enter my name and my collaborator's name and the high score list in Arabic. Many people will look at this and think that this supports Arabic, but this is actually gibberish. This is a very, very common bug. It's actually so common, if you advance to the next slide, that I run a blog documenting this exact single bug that just shows up all over the place. What you saw on the previous slide were Arabic letters typeset from left to right, so backwards, and not connected, which means they don't approach being readable by an Arabic speaker. They may as well be chicken scratch. And this is because in English, a rendering engine that is designed for English is consuming and trying to render Arabic characters, and it doesn't know how to connect them, and it doesn't know how to lay them out. If you jump to the next slide, what all of these things do is they serve as a constant reminder to anyone whose native language is not English, or if we want to be broader about that, is Latin based. The emotional effect that has, or that's had on me and people that I've known, is that it serves as a constant reminder that you're not really, this wasn't made for you. There are some places where your presence has been made a little bit easier, has been made a little bit less difficult, but in general, you're out of place, and that's not the kind of democratizing platform that I think computation and the internet could be or should be. It's certainly not enough. But all of these sort of compound to the reality that ELB can never be practical. And if you jump to the next slide, nothing like ELB can really ever be practical. Anything, any sort of foundational technology that's not based on, that's meant to be readable by humans, but it's not based on the ASCII character set, can't ever really be practical. And if you'll just, if you'll jump to the next slide, because interacting with the outside world means interacting with its assumptions, and all the basic protocols and APIs that you need to make practical use of your computer and computation are all specified in English. And you can quickly cycle through the next 4 slides. These are examples from the C# standard library, the LLVM, bitcode spec, OpenGL, and then finally HTTP. These are all human-readable protocols, right? These are all human-readable APIs. They're designed. You can look at them. You see something like, accept ranges, backend timing, content control, content language. These are things as an English speaker I can reason about. But if you jump to the next slide, again, the conclusion that I have to reach from all this is that the idea of something being human-readable has been equated with just rendering it in American English, which is extremely, extremely problematic. Politically and practically, if we want to bring computation to the world. The next slide, if you jump to the next slide, almost the last couple of slides. So the nature of software is that it interacts with other things. And if all those other things are laden with cultural assumptions, then you either choose not to interact with them or you inherit those cultural assumptions. So for something like ELB to work, you would have to rewrite most of the software that's been written in the last 40 years, which is a daunting task And even then would only add one additional language to the pantheon, which is not a solution that I'm interested in. ELB was made in Arabic because I'm an Arabic speaker and that's my lived experience. But ELB is not really about Arabs or Arabic. ELB is about everyone else. That's the focus of that project. And a lot of the feedback that I've received on it has been from Russian programmers, Chinese programmers, Indian programmers who have expressed the frustration that they had to learn English before they could really program a computer. If you jump to the next slide, this is something that whenever I talk about ELB comes up, people talk about creating translation layers. Maybe you can have an automatic translation from English API into an Arabic API, or the API of your local language. If you jump to the next slide, this doesn't work. There are systems that do that, and it's a nice stopgap solution. But I think that this is really not enough. This is a project called Chinese Python. And if you look closely, in the heart of all that Chinese text is the English word range, because that's the name of the function in the Python API. So there are, in any kind of translation effort, there are always going to be gaps and holes, because again, text is hard. Automated translation never really meaningfully works. And if you jump to the next slide, a translation layer, all that would do is create second-class citizens of non-English languages, which they effectively already are. So to me, this isn't a huge improvement. It's not something I'm willing to invest my time in. If you jump to the next slide, I'll tell one last quick story, and that'll be the end of my presentation. I hope I haven't gone too much over time. This sort of an unexpected side effect of the ELB project is what I felt is an accidental long-term performance art piece, where I presented it at the beginning of 2013 originally at IBeam. And since then, every couple of months, almost without fail, at least every 2 months or so, I get an email from someone in the Middle East who's discovering it for the first time, who's very excited about the possibility of learning Arabic, learning how to program in Arabic, and wants to know, if there are tutorials and how to get started. And this is 3 years now. I've had to give the exact same speech to so many excited young Arabic programmers and tell them that I'm sorry, this is an art piece. It can't be practical because of everything that I've mentioned to you in this presentation, interacting with the systems and all the cultural assumptions that come with that. I'm sorry, I don't have anything for you. I know you came to me with this excitement and I have nothing for you. And it breaks my heart every single time. And that to me is evidence that this is something that people want. Some of the feedback that I got when I made ELB is that, well, English isn't that hard to learn. I don't know why you're making such a big deal about it. Or that, this isn't really a problem. We've never really experienced this as a problem. The sort of dismissive feedback that I've received that I think is completely off. I think people are frustrated that they do need to buy into a particular written culture to program a computer. To really have what I think is the only healthy relationship you can have with computation, which is being able to control it yourself. You have to adopt a written culture that is not necessarily your own. And then the last slide is just the name of the project, and I'll close on that. So I hope that was coherent and helpful. And if there are any questions, and if there's time for questions, I'll be more than happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramzi, for this presentation and for the work. I think this really helps us stretch the imagination what human rights can mean. I think that's also the role of this presentation have. And I already see people lining up at the queue for the Q&A and discussion. And I like to go to the queue. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Chris Newman. I was thinking about one of the IETF specs we have, which is RFC 2277, published in 1998, which sets the policy for languages and character sets in internet protocols done through the IETF. And one of the requirements is you must support UTF-8.
Cool.
But my suspicion is that specs, having been written in 1998, could use an update, and it might be helpful to have an update from somebody whose perspective is not European. So that was, I'm very sympathetic to the work you're doing. I'm wondering if we can make things a little better by being more accommodating in the future, because I know I did a lot of work on localizing email addresses in the IETF. So there are people who care here.
Yeah, no, I'm sure there are, and I appreciate that. And I will look up that RFC. I'm not particularly familiar with it. I do to that point. I do want to say that I am extremely grateful to the work that you all do, and the very real effort. I mean, a lot of it does. I mean, at the content layer, some of it does tend to work well enough. And Arabic websites function, and browsers are able to render Arabic text coherently. So I mean, I remember a time when it was a lot worse. But frankly, when it comes to protocols, and this is where I don't have a good answer, when you're talking about the keys in a key value format like HTTP headers, what should the keys be? It is very convenient that they're just English words, and then English speakers you could just look at an HTTP header and be able to parse it. But should they be binary numbers, and then every number has just an abstract meaning that it has an equivalent meaning in local languages, but that's not encoded in the packet? I don't know if that's a step forward or not. We definitely get into the area of how do we get human beings who don't speak the same language to communicate with each other, and I really don't have any good answers.
Thank you, Ramzi. Adding to the queue.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Andrew Sullivan, and for the last couple of years I've been on the IAB, and one of the jobs that I had there was as program lead for the internationalization program. So, I'm not speaking with that hat, but I wanted to set that as some of the context. So the first thing that I want to say before I start my little rant is I think that you're quite right that that there is a sort of cultural bias that's built into some of these to some of the environment that we're with, and I recognize that is an issue for people who come from a different linguistic tradition, and I don't want to dismiss that at all. Secondly, you're absolutely right. The text is really hard. And internationalization is a complete swamp. You have barely touched the surface of this in this little thing for those who are here in the room. So with that said, I've got a couple of reservations about the argument that you've made. And the first is really that that the programming languages are, quote, in English, or for that matter, in any language. I think that what is certainly true is that they come out of a linguistic tradition that is formed pretty heavily by the linguistic tradition of American computer scientists, and I think that is unambiguously true. But I want to be very careful about stepping from there to in a language, because actually this thing comes up over and over again, precisely because they're really arbitrary identifiers, right, in a lot of these cases. And it happens to be that they conform to the linguistic prejudices of a set of people who happened to be Americans. And had we, been developing this at a different period of time, we probably would have come up with a different sort of writing system for it. But that said, we make our tools, and our tools make us. So there's the fact of the matter that we've got this deployed stuff, and it has created facts in the world that we cannot actually do anything about. So over time, if we want to do internationalization of the protocols underlying pieces on the wire, header fields or whatever, that actually takes much longer than it even took to deploy the thing in the first place, because not only do you have to displace the old stuff, but you've also got to come up with some kind of agreement about the intermediary things. And it's not always efficient. In fact, it's frequently inefficient to use some intermediate way of looking this up, because then you've got to have lookup tables and so on, and everything gets more bloated. So there really are engineering trade-offs there that have to be taken quite seriously, and I think that it is tempting to say, well, this is just in English, and therefore it's sort of unfair. But I think it would be better to say this linguistic tradition sort of gets imposed by virtue of embracing the programming environment. And then there's a legitimate question there about what we ought to do about that. But I just want to make a distinction there. Finally, and this is the real reason I got up, we have a real problem with internationalization at the IETF, and that's for two reasons. The first is we don't actually normally do user interface, right? We often say we're bad at user interface and we don't want to get up there.
Yeah.
But the problem is that we've got all these identifiers that leak up from our protocols into user space. And the most obvious examples of those are email addresses like local parts, the server part, or domain names. But actually, it turns out it's all over the place. And this has been a constant problem for us. And actually, many of our protocols right now are broken because we had wrong assumptions about the way Unicode has encoded Arabic scripts. And that fact actually leads us to the second problem, and that is we don't have enough expertise here to be doing this properly. So in the IAB's internationalization program for the past couple of years, this problem has been stalled because we can't actually get enough people to work on the problem. So if there are people here who are interested in internationalization and are willing to listen to the really boring, long, involved distinctions that many of us have to make, because, for instance, the difference between language and script is actually a really hard, complicated one that you need to pay a lot of attention to, we would really welcome the additional volunteers. We desperately need more eyes. We desperately need more energy on this. The suggestion of 2277 that I think Chris made, actually don't read it. It's wrong. It's full of garbage, and it's sitting on my hard drive. Is the beginning of the update that never got finished because it's such a monumental task. So we need more energy, and it would be appreciated as long as we keep those distinctions in mind. Whether we're in a language or a script or what the conditions are. Thanks.
That's excellent.
Thank you, Andrew. With this, I'd like to close the queue and ask you to keep the answers short because we got much more thought-provoking things coming up.
Cool.
But I don't want to stop the discussion as well. So let's take some time, but also be mindful of other things.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I've thought a lot about. I take what you said very seriously about the engineering challenges versus it's all in English and it's not fair. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think. On one hand, when you're writing code, they are arbitrary identifiers, but on the other hand, there is a meaningful practical advantage to being able to internalize their meanings because they are English words, right? There's a reason they're not random characters, and there's a reason behind that. So I think it is both that it is it's a result of history that we are where we are, and I imagine sometimes what it was like to design ASCII in the '60s, and just computers barely functioning. And just being able to encode text at all being an achievement, yeah, they weren't thinking about Arabic. They weren't thinking about Chinese or Japanese, or of course not. That'd be absurd. And you do have to take on bloat to support all that. So I certainly don't blame anyone or shake my fist at anyone past or present. But I also don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. I think it is unfair. While recognizing that it's a serious engineering challenge, and there's a status quo that needs to be dealt with.
All right. Hi, Sean Leonard. Yeah, ditto to all that. I actually have a question or a point to raise, I think, because this is a very interesting presentation. Of course, you're giving it to the IETF, but how many of the problems that you've identified legitimately with trying to create a new programming language are obviously impacting on internet work, but really are about systems work, right? The way that Unix was created and has been standardized. For example, the IEEE's work with POSIX or other environments like that, right? I mean, a lot of, clearly, because a lot of the internet came out of work on Multics and VMS and all these other systems, it inherited that same tradition, but maybe the place to start is actually at the endpoints, namely the standards and standards bodies that govern the operation of these systems before it even hits the wire and is communicated to other parties.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I mean, this is a presentation that I could give, I think, almost unmodified to any number of standards boards and organizations like you all. So yeah, I mean, this is not exclusive to the IETF by any means. The way that the work that I did directly impacts on it is I started to think about writing an HTTP library for ELB, and I immediately hit that reality that you have to generate ASCII characters on the wire. That's just what HTTP is. There's no two ways about it. And then what does that mean for a language that doesn't explicitly by design doesn't support that? And for Elb, I don't know. That's why it still doesn't have an HTTP library. But that's how, I mean, the moment you try and do anything practical, you immediately hit those barriers. And the HTTP is where I hit it when it came to the internet stuff.
That's a great ending and a great bridge to to the next speaker. Go ahead.
So Mark Nottingham. So first I want to acknowledge, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, this is unfair. And we shouldn't beat about the bush about that. Speaking about HTTP, syntactically, field values are ASCII. The names are ASCII. Yeah. The field names are ASCII, and the field values are effectively a bucket of octets. So you can have arbitrary, it doesn't have to be text, it can be anything in the field values that may break some software, but that software is broken. Sorry. There are some constraints, but they aren't going to affect this particular situation, I don't think. But there are constraints. The field names, I don't think it's not possible to change them at this point in time. Even with new versions of HTTP, we need to keep backwards compatibility. There's a whole set of problems around that, and I think you understand that. But looking at the situation, I'm not sure even if I could that I would, because HTTP header field names are about interoperability. You can't have 5 different terms meaning the same thing. It has to be the same one around the world. That's, and unless you're creating your own. Now, if you're creating your own header for your own use case, that is a different thing. And for new protocol elements, that's the interesting question, I think. The experience that I've had, though, is in the Atom working group. I was the editor for my sins of the Atom syntax, the RSS replacement back in the day. And at the time, it was very much the thing that we wanted to use IRIs wherever possible and allow arbitrary internationalized text wherever possible, including not only in things we're going to be presented to users, but also in protocol elements. And that ended up causing a lot of problems because of homophone attacks, because of canonicalization issues, and all of these different things. And of course, with wire protocols, there's even another concern, which is performance. That by 2-byte variable encodings, you're making certain uses very difficult. So when I think about this problem in the large, and again, I agree with you, it's unfair and it is a problem. I think about where the lower hanging fruit is. By internationalizing HTTP headers, we're making the lives of a set of developers better. That is a set of a certain size. But then I think about, okay, internationalizing HTML and JavaScript and the set of developers that empowers. And that is a much larger set of developers. And with things like web components happening in the W3C, we're very close to a horizon where you can write Arabic HTML where there's not a lick of English in the tags anywhere. And that's pretty exciting. So I guess that's my feedback is looking at the low-hanging fruit might be something to do for now. But if we can get guidance for the future for IETF when we create new protocols, that's great. The existing ones are problematic.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Ramzi, some famous last words.
Yeah, I'll sort of flaunt my ignorance as my sort of closing remarks because I think I need to stress that. I mean, you said that even if you could change the values of the HTTP the header fields, you don't know that you would. I don't even know what you would change them to. Like, I don't want them to be Arabic. Like, that's not the goal here at all. I don't think it should all be one language is the problem. But then how do you pick a set of header fields that, even without getting into the efficiency of wire protocols, how do you pick a set of header fields that's readable around the world? And that's a much bigger problem than computation or the internet or protocols. This is a problem of just human beings interacting with one another. And I really don't know what you would even change them to.
So this is Mark again. I very much agree. And I think for me, the most I can hope for is that if you want to create an Arabic header for a use case that's local to you, you should be able to do that. Right. It shouldn't be just, all headers shouldn't have to be the same language. And in the meantime, the only thing that comes to mind is tooling. If we have, I have a tool that interprets HTTP responses and helps people understand what they do. It'd be nice to internationalize that so that you don't have to read English to understand that HTTP response.
Right.
Ramzi, thank you very much for the discussion. People, thank you very much for the questions. I would like to thank you again very much and to continue to the presentation of Nick Doty. I'm gonna press this famous red button and see what it does.
He's still there.
Well, as often with buttons.
Has to be in the queue.
Yeah.
It has to be in the queue.
Meet echo.
Okay, I'll find one for this side. Where's the one for this side? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I don't see the queue either.
Oh, no, I see Joe now as the, and I see Nick. There's Nick. Excellent. Nick, take it away.
Are there slides too? Can you see my slides? There we go. Hi everyone. Can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm Nick Doty. I'm a graduate student at the UC Berkeley School of Information. I'm also a director there of the Center for Technology, Society, and Policy. And I have some experience at IETF and W3C. Sorry, I'm picking up some echo. I spent several years working for the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, working on their privacy projects, including Do Not Track. The things I'd like to talk about, you can see in this outline, are some of the work we've done researching, reviewing for privacy and security in internet and web standards. In addition, some of the research about the actual process, the organizational theory behind the multi-stakeholder process. In addition to those results and maybe how they can be applicable to other human rights considerations, there are a couple other human rights issues that I'd like us to start looking at, and maybe the internationalization talk has already got us thinking about that. And then after that, I'd like to get into methods. It's unusual for an academic to discuss methods at the end of the talk rather than the beginning, but I know that you're considering methods as a substantive issue for this group. So I'd like to talk about some of the methods, interesting methods we can use. And finally, ways that we can collaborate. Hopefully that academics can collaborate with you all. So to jump into the work we've done on security and privacy, this is a sort of historical piece that might be familiar to many of you. This is a quote from RFC 3552 that historically, security consideration sections have been relatively weak. That was written published in 2003, and you can see a graph here. Sorry if it doesn't show up quite as well on your screen. That there weren't security considerations sections before 1990. That they remained very short into the early 2000s, and that in more recent times there's a range of lengths of those sections. But we have some very substantial ones now, in addition to some that are still one line saying there are no security considerations in this document. Most people agreed these could be improved. That saying there are no security considerations is often simply incorrect or misleading. And so 3552 was trying to provide some guidance. I think we saw similar experience in privacy and similar experience in other values. I think we might hear similar things from internationalization or accessibility, that some authors will say, well, there's no considerations here. And we seem to agree that it could be improved. Now, the things we've done to improve are these next steps. I've typically seen discussion of people, processes, and tools as ways to do better. And both the Internet Engineering Task Force and the World Wide Web Consortium have developed in both of those areas. So this is a list of some of the groups of people doing reviews or providing guidance or just general discussion. The PER-PASS is a mailing list discussing pervasive passive surveillance. and it seems important to look at the actual groups of people who are doing things in their training. On the second column, though, these are some of the tools we've been using. 3552 is guidance on how to write a security consideration section. 6973 is privacy considerations. 7258 you may know as setting some of the priorities to talk about pervasive monitoring. And these last two are documents we've been working on in the World Wide Web Consortium as questionnaire style. Questions authors can ask themselves, or that reviewers can ask to spot issues, spot privacy or security issues early on. If you go to the next slide, I can talk about some of the trends that we've noticed in doing these reviews. Those trends are, and if you have a URL, you can read the relevant papers. The first is a move towards making things more systematic. So you can do ad hoc spotting of problems and trying to fix them. But there's a trend in both security and privacy towards trying to make a more stable, repeatable process, where you have a known group of people who are going to do the review. You have tools or checklists to make sure they're asking the same questions. You have issues that are tracked and followed up. Partly those are lessons learned from other areas, accessibility and internationalization, other sort of cross-cutting concerns. And I think that's going to be a similar trend for other values. Sorry, the previous slide still. Integration, we've been noticing integration among both people and groups between things like privacy and security. While those may have different concerns and different definitions, although it varies, we've been noticed quite a bit of overlap in the methods or the people or the sort of threat model style approach that people are using. Finally, we've noticed some trend of leadership. There's certainly an interest in using process. Standards organizations have processes just to try to catch things like this, but that process is not sufficient. That we also need people, usually notable leaders in these groups, stepping up and making sure that values are considered. So those are the overall trends we've seen in reviewing for privacy and security. Hopefully those can be applicable to other values. To go to the next slide, we can also talk about some of the important things we've noticed in the process, in the actual multi-stakeholder standard setting process. We published a paper a few years ago about these internet multi-stakeholder processes and techno-policy standards. Some of these standards that explicitly addressed, in this case, privacy issues. Those themes sort of focus on things like participation, the people you can get involved, and how those people can interact with one another. In that area, we've drawn heavily on this concept of boundary organizations from a couple other authors. That standards bodies have an opportunity. You have an opportunity while at IETF to try to get interaction between both competing organizations and organizations that are essentially in different fields. But that the IETF can be an intersection of those fields and enable some collaboration that wouldn't necessarily happen otherwise. There's a question of expertise that particularly as these technical or what we might have thought of as purely technical issues are also affecting values like privacy, security, or other human rights, it's going to be a challenge to get the people who understand both sides of that issue. And finally, legitimacy. They're both questions about procedural legitimacy, about how to make a standards process create a fair outcome. I think the consensus model we use has some real advantages there, but also the substantive legitimacy, which might depend on things like who's participating. So those are just some high-level trends, both from the privacy and security reviewing and the multi-stakeholder process. I think we should also be looking at other values, though, and that's a real interest for me. At Berkeley, we have a new Center for Technology, Society, and Policy. We're trying to find issues at that intersection that haven't been as well studied, and I think things like privacy are fairly well understood, but we're getting into areas where we don't have as much history or experience. So on the next slide, one example is diversity and representation. Yeah, there we go. I've been going to some of the Unicode Consortium meetings. That's one other fellow standards body we work with. And one of their recent accomplishments has been emoji diversity, skin tone diversity. The news article that I'm quoting here, of course, quotes Apple, quotes one company pledging to make emoji more ethnically diverse. That was in response to a rather large public outcry that the actual characters that people were sending to one another didn't look like them, and it's labeled as, oh well, this one company is going to respond, because in many cases people didn't realize the interoperability, the standards process that we had to go through. So that's one issue, and hopefully the internationalization discussion you just had maybe gets at that at another level. The second issue I think we need to be looking at is that of harassment and free expression. So at Berkeley, we've been having reading groups and discussions of these two books. We can go to the next slide now. Two books from Danielle Citron and Sarah Jiang relatively recently about hate crimes, harassment, and other types of abuse on the internet. It seems to me that this is one of the major issues that's preventing free expression online. It's not just the actual ability to communicate this, but the responses that people are getting. I think there might be some technical measures, some standard setting measures that we could pursue that would help with that. One example might be block together. The concept of shared block lists might be a way to improve responding, filtering, blocking harassment without everyone having to handle it individually. And we've also been discussing just things like a link rel attribute that would enable discoverability to report harassment. There might be things we could learn from spam. That's been one suggestion, that there's been a ton of technical work done on preventing spam online. It required both some interesting internal work within organizations, but also some standards and communication methods to describe block lists. Okay, those are the values. Let me talk a little bit about some methods we can use. On the next slide, the things that I've looked at are methods related to ethnography. That's a method of studying a culture by sort of emic analysis of the perspectives of the members themselves. And that might be a mix of both qualitative and quantitative methods. I think we can use the two of those in good combination. So to go to the qualitative methods on the next slide, I've used things like semi-structured interviews with participants in standard setting. I know Hrpc has done that, has done some of that as well. Participant observation, there are so many interesting standards meetings where we get to see these discussions happen. Discourse analysis has been used by scholars such as Sandra Brahman to actually try to find which issues are being discussed just by looking through documents themselves. And if you're a participant like me, and I hope many of you are also participating in other working groups, you might learn something just from self-reflection. Those are qualitative methods, so hopefully it's identifying themes or getting you hypotheses that you can test in other ways. As an example, here are a couple of quotes from interviews I did with IETF participants that helped me see some of these leadership issues in security reviews. I'll move on because we're a little low on time here. The quantitative methods can be textual analysis. We have so much text in standard setting we should take advantage of. To jump ahead to that graph, Yeah, one more slide ahead. We can measure things like how often terms are being mentioned in published standards. Sorry, one slide before that. So this is code that's available on GitHub if you want to look at it, but we can very quickly study all the RFCs or all the W3C TRs. Mailing list activity shows interesting things after the Snowden revelations, for example, on the next slide. And finally, there's some ability to use social network analysis. This graph shows your group, shows the Hrpc mailing list, who's talking most often and to whom, and trying to divide that up into groups. There are interesting automated models we can do when we have this large mailing list type data. To wrap up on collaboration, I'm really interested in how we can get more academics involved in standard setting, either using these methods or other ones. In particular, we're trying to fund projects in infrastructure, standards, and governance. We'd be interested in talking to other people about that. And it might be that research that's done on or about standard setting and human rights can fit into sort of larger projects on how we can engineer these values in general. Thanks very much. I'd be happy to answer questions or talk with anyone offline.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Anybody have a question? No, we don't have anybody at the line, and we don't have anybody standing in the queue. We do have a question.
Sorry, I was a little late getting to the queue.
No, thank you. I babbled on so you'd have time.
Thank you. Christine Runiger from the Internet Society, but speaking in my capacity as co-chair of the W3C Privacy Interest Group, otherwise known as PING. Thank you very much, Nick. That was an excellent introduction. And I'd also take the opportunity to say thank you to Nick, because he has done a lot of work to move forward the work of privacy considerations in web standards. One of the things I'm really interested in too, which dovetails with what Nick said, is how can we get more expertise in the privacy work, whether it's academic or otherwise, so that we can do more effective privacy reviews of web standards in the W3C and also RFCs here. So if anyone has an interest in privacy, particularly with expertise in web standards, please come and see me. I'm down the back. Okay.
Thank you. I see no more questions, so thank you, Nick. I see you've already moved out of the spotlight there. So the next thing we have on the agenda is a discussion of the research draft. And Corinne, you're going to do that? Okay. Or do you want to? Yeah, you might as well since you're here.
So, can everybody hear me? So I'm going to go over the new research draft that is a result of the merger of the two last ones. What can do? Nope. I'll take it. Then I'm going to ask you to do the thingamajig. All right, I'll start, but let's get going. So slide 2, please. So the question that keeps all of us awake at night, can internet protocols affect human rights? Some of the work that we've been doing is trying to get closer to answering that question. So next slide. We have a new draft out. So there's a couple of things that are important to sort of discuss. When it comes to this, there's several things. We've refactored it. There are some merges in it. Methodology improvements, we've added some case studies, there's a new literature and discussion section, and what I'm most excited about is the first draft of the Human Rights Protocol considerations. So when it comes to refactoring, so the last two drafts had a combination of the work that we wanted to do in the future and the work that we had already done. Now we're at a point where we don't need to make that difference anymore. So we've taken out all of the references that said, in the future, we plan to do X, Y, Z, because it's been done for the most part, which makes the document as a whole much more pleasant to read. Next slide, please. So this document is a project of the merger of the methodology and the glossary. The glossary was actually an outcome of one of the research steps that we set out to do. And the whole idea of this is to have a stronger, more consolidated draft. And as you will see, if you look at it, the glossary became vocabulary used in the draft that we have now. When it comes to methodology, obviously, we're a research group. So it was pointed out in the mailing list and also in discussions we had with people offline that there was definitely some room for improvement when it came to making sure it was properly academically embedded. So we added references. We took some steps to do extra explanation where that was necessary. So we've also added additional case studies just to make everything a little bit more tangible. And I'm going to go over the 3 case studies that we've added most recently. So the first one is DDoS. The question arose, like, to what extent are DDoS attacks something that enables or threatens human rights? We had a very long, elaborate, good discussion about this on the list. And the consensus that came from it is that from a technical perspective, speaking from the IETF, that sort of the difference between a legitimate and illegitimate attack doesn't really mean much, because the problem is, like, here you need to be consistent in the face of an attack. An attack is an attack is an attack is an attack. So you can't create protocols that sometimes enable them and at other times prohibit them. And the end conclusion was that, like, nobody benefits from having a weaker infrastructure. So another case study that we did was HTTP. So the interesting thing about this is that it would allow the operators to operate with greater transparency in the case of where sort of law or public policy issues affect their working. But something to keep in mind, and this is something that was pointed out on the list at several points, is that it's useful when you're trying to focus on cooperative legal versions of content removal from requests. Like, it's not a solution for all types of censorship. But when it is there, when the status code is used, it does have a very positive effect on human rights. There's all sorts of things that it has a positive effect on, like due process, transparency, other things that are listed here. Next slide, please. Middle boxes. So middle boxes is a discussion that is still somewhat ongoing, or at least perhaps it should be on the list, because we've definitely identified a lot of tension. So there's the tension between privacy and network optimization. There's also the question of what does this do to the end-to-end principle. There's a lot of security concerns that haven't really been addressed properly. And then there's also the question of CDNs and access. Like, if you have a CDN and you're asking for a certain page, it doesn't come from the original source. So should you as an end user be informed of this? And for instance, if it comes from a CDN and if the page is changed, should that be something that the end user should know about? So these are all questions that are still sort of up in the air, very specific to CDN. And in general, there's also the question of, we're talking about middle boxes in general right now. To what extent should we be discussing different types of middle boxes? So this is something I invite you all to sort of contribute to on the list, because it's still ongoing. Oops, sorry about that. Well, obviously, as I mentioned before, we added a new literature review and a discussion section to go a little bit more in depth into the academic references that we've named before. So during the last meeting, we discussed Clark et al. And Brown et al. We've now also added Broeders and Bless and Orwat. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Broeders argues that the internet architecture should be seen as a public good. And he says the only way we can do that is by declaring the backbone of the internet as a public good. So that includes TCP/IP, standards, the DNS, all of it. And if you do that, by declaring it a public good, it automatically gets the associated affordances that you would get when something is considered to be a public good. Then for Bless and Orwat, we had the pleasure of having Bless actually present during the Prague meeting at the IETF. The argument that Bless and Orwat make is that you can't just focus on technological solutions. You need to work with the community, make sure that there is some sort of understanding of the potential impact that technical design decisions have on the real world, and try and combine that knowledge with technical solutions. It's probably also interesting to at least sort of talk a little bit about the position of the research group, because I can imagine, especially in the beginning, that a lot of people were very nervous about where is this going, what exactly are they saying. So the position that we have now is that you can't, it's not necessary to hard code human rights into protocols. And it's difficult, near to impossible, and you sort of blaze over the fact that every situation is dependent on the specific context. That being said, it is important to at least make explicit the potential impact that design decisions have on social values, on human rights. And this can be done using the human rights protocol considerations. And now for the most exciting part. So the question is, how can we do this? What questions can engineers ask themselves when developing or improving protocols to at least take into account or have thought through the potential impact this might have on human rights? So what we've done in this draft is take a first stab at that. Put down some questions and see if it works. Overall, the idea is for technical engineers to go through this and to sort of make a comprehensive analysis of the potential impact, positive, negative, neutral, whatever you might have on human rights. Now, the method through which we think this is going to be most effective is through a questionnaire. So we set up a whole bunch of different questions that people can ask themselves. And the results that we then hopefully get is that people have gone through the thought process and that it's documented so that we can see how different concerns, different human rights, different technical issues were weighed. It's important to say that we don't necessarily say there are specific things you need to do. That's not what this is about. So an example of this that you can see in the ID as well is, for instance, accessibility. Sometimes you can create certain barriers for people to use the web. Now, the questions you can ask yourself when it comes to this is your protocol designed to provide an enabling environment for people with disabilities? And then, for instance, you could look at some of the references here from the W3C. The questions you can also ask is your protocol optimized for low bandwidth and high latency connections? Could your protocol also be developed in a stateless manner? And this impacts the different rights that we've stated below. So the right to non-discrimination, right to freedom of assembly and association, right to education, and right to political participation. Now, this specific bit comes from some of the work we've been doing before, which is trying to understand how different human rights relate to different technical concepts. So next steps. This is where we're at now, but there's still a lot of questions to be answered. So for instance, right now we've made these guidelines in question form. Like, does that work? Is that something you can work with? Are there too many questions? Are there too few questions? The other thing something we've run into, and Nick Doty actually made a really good suggestion when it came to this, is the formulation of the question. Because he had a look at it and said, for instance, well, the problem is that with some of these questions, you formulate them in a sense that it says, does your protocol do bad thing X? Well, then obviously people are going to be like, no, it doesn't, and they can check the box and move on. So you need to do this in a way that it doesn't have that effect. So a specific example that he mentioned this under was censorship resistance. So we initially had the phrase that said, does your protocol make censorship easier by exposing specific identifiers that could be sensitive for filtering? Does your protocol do bad thing X? So then we changed it to, does this protocol introduce new identifiers that might be associated with persons or contact? And then with an explanation below of how this might be something that's important to answer. So this is something that would probably have to happen for all of the questions that are there now. There's still a lot of room for improvement. And on which note, it would also be really, really great if we could check this in the wild. If there's somebody who is working on a draft who thinks, well, this is an interesting exercise. I have some spare time, and I'll try and see what happens if I try to answer these questions with my draft. And then I come to sort of the last point, or the last question. After this meeting, after taking in all the comments that we've gotten from you so far and the comments that we hope to get for the rest of the meeting, can we call for an adoption by the research group of this draft? Thank you very much.
There was a rabbit queue lining up there, even halfway. So that can only mean interesting things. Please. to say your name and go ahead.
Roland Bliss, KIT. I just want to make a comment on the literature thingy. I guess we were a little bit misinterpreted, but one point is that maybe implementing, yeah, you just skipped over it. Okay. Maybe it's not possible to, or not desirable to implement or hard code human rights into protocols. But some design decisions may have implicit or may put implicit restrictions on certain human rights. And I guess our main point was also to just create an awareness for that. And I guess, yeah, the direction right now is to pose questions. Did you consider or take certain considerations into account while designing your protocol? So that's maybe a good way to go. But as the way it's written now on the draft looks like that we have a counterposition which isn't true, right? And we also have written an article which will appear in the April issue of CCR about values and networks. So I will post a link to this when it comes available, right?
Perfect. Very, very happy with your comments and very happy to adjust the text in a way that it better reflects your points.
Okay.
Mark Nottingham. You mentioned the W3C security questionnaire, and that's work we're doing at the TAG in conjunction with Mike West. Excuse me. It seems to me that there's an opportunity for maybe convergence or maybe just sharing experience with that. I'm the TAG member who's currently responsible for shepherding that document, and we're in a phase where we're letting it sit and letting people use it to see how it goes. We're going to revisit that at our face-to-face in July, right after the IETF in Berlin. So if you'd like to coordinate on that, I'd love to. It seems like there's maybe some cross-organization coordination that might be useful there.
Definitely, I'd love to.
Okay, great. You mentioned earlier briefly that protocols shouldn't be stateless. I think that's potentially a dangerous or at least easily misunderstood comment. Should not be. Sorry, should be stateless. Yeah. See, it's so confusing.
Could they be developed in a stateless manner?
Sure. A stateless protocol means many things, and in different contexts. And sometimes it's possible and good, and sometimes it's not possible, or it's not that much of a problem. So, I would hate for a document to say, you know, make protocol stateless, and for engineers to come along and say, well, they don't know what they're talking about, and dismiss the entire document as a result. So if we can get that kind of nuance in, that would be good.
No, that would be great. If it just means the questions need to be adjusted.
Okay. And finally, you talked about CDNs.
Mm-hmm.
I will preface by saying I work for a CDN, but I would not dream of speaking about for it in this context.
Mm-hmm.
You'll just get my personal opinions, which hopefully won't be too tainted by that association. A CDN acts on behalf of the origin server, and they have a legal relationship of some sort, and so really it's an agent. And so if we go down that path, you have to start thinking, well, should the end user know that it's hosted by Amazon, or that it's on a Dell computer? You know, there are many different parties involved in serving content on the internet, and the question is, who has legal authority? Who has, you know, who ties all that together to be responsible for that content? So I don't know it's useful to identify a CDN. Having said that, CDNs are very interested in making sure that it's possible for them not to provably not be touching the bytes or doing things that are you know, untoward. So if we can develop technical mechanisms to make that more possible, I think everybody would like that. What's more interesting is when a party who isn't associated with one of the endpoints of communication gets their fingers in it.
Yep.
And that's something that I think most of us can agree is something we should try and prevent.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. The CDNs were the last bit where the discussion stopped. So, I mean, there's definitely a lot of room to still demarcate and put in the points that you just made.
Giovanni Mota. Just want to remind you about, you talked about mailboxes here today. Today there was a presentation at the MapRG, Paul Hoffman from ICANN. I'm not sure if you guys saw that. They're building a lab on middle boxes. So if you want to run any measurements, just talk to him. He can run anything for you there to check what the boxes do.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Corinne. And I'd like to quickly come back to two last questions Corinne asked, because I think it would really benefit the research. Are there people working on a draft right now that they would be interested in running across the human rights considerations to see if it works and makes sense in the wild? Yeah, Shane? That's nice. Nice. Let's connect after and then work on that. I'm very happy with that. And so we had some very useful contributions here to the comments on the draft. We'll be working on them. We also got some other comments on the list. We'll be working on them, and then you will be probably can expect a call for adoption by the research group within the coming month, 2 months. So looking forward to that discussion on the list as well. And with that, I am handing over to Avri.
Thank you. My turn to stand in the box. Avri Doria. So anyhow, can I have my one slide, please? So I could even click it, maybe. Yeah, there. I only have one slide. And this document is actually one that I sort of committed to do at the beginning, and I suffered over for a while because I wasn't really quite sure where it fit in. And where it's developing is into something that someone can read if they don't want to dive into the methodology, to give sort of an overview of where we're going with this thing. One of the other things I'm trying to, so it's a companion to the doc that was just talked about. But if you read the two docs and if you listen to the conversations that go on among us sometimes, you'll realize that there's almost a point counterpoint going on. And in fact, you'll see it in some of the comments that I sent on the previous draft asking for more scientific rigor, for example, or something like that. So anyhow, it was renamed and reworked, taking into account the merge that had happened on the other document. Now, one of the things that I'm trying to do is in the research doc, they did a very proper listing and going through of all the research and saying we use this and it said that. What I would like to try and do in this draft is sort of expand those descriptions of the research so the people that aren't going to go back and do the literature search and read all the articles have more of a synopsis as opposed to the one sentence that's being used to say the document says this. And I call myself an editor on this document because I'm hoping to get people to help write those as opposed to me going in my very slow pace, reading everything, doing an analysis, writing in, and then I'm hoping I got it right. And in fact, you know, one of the ones that I already wrote, I already got a couple corrections. Like, I didn't quite say that, so I fixed it. So if anybody wants to take any of these research articles or even write the short synopsis of your own, I would truly appreciate it. So I've added that, and that's much, so there's much yet to be written that. I also went and took, I hadn't quite connected it to the broader work, but there's been a lot of discussion beyond what was already discussed in terms of the internet or the internet backbone as a public good. There's also been a lot of economists arguing that it can't be, that it does not meet the definition of a public good. And I don't want to go through that at this point, but however, you know, a certain amount of discussion and then has gotten to the point of, but maybe the protocols are. Maybe the core protocols are a public good because they're infinitely shareable and you can't use them up. Whereas when you talk about the internet, there's bandwidth constraints and there's all kinds of things that basically defeat the economic definition of a public good. So one of the questions that's being looked at, one of the things I need to do is go back to Bruder's work and fit that into the discussion of this. One of the things I'm not sure about is how far to go on this discussion. But one of the reasons I did want to include it is that it is becoming very much a discussion that comes up all the time in the policy circles. And once something gets defined as a public good, then there's certain constraints that are on it. So it's one of the reasons that I was looking into that issue and it also comes up in the research document. So that's part of it. One of the things that I discussed is the where do we go now on the research side, which was also talked about a little bit more. I think that the ethnographic work that was done was very good at discovering the possibilities. But I think in terms of going further and sort of saying there are these things that have these effects, there are protocol features that seem to have various enabling or disabling effects, if we want to go there, takes a little bit more methodological or rigorous sort of, I don't know if it's experimentation, but more investigation on it. Part of it is seeing how these things are used, seeing whether there really is a protocol implementation, a protocol artifact that makes a difference or doesn't make a difference. So basically, where do we go now that we have the ethnographic evidence that there is a concern here, but how do we take it to the point where an engineer could read it and sort of say, yeah, I could see why that might be the case, or not. And so that was one of the things that I talked about. And then I included a section a little bit on the emergent issues, talked a little bit more about the DDoS and freedom of expression from a different aspect. And one of the things that shows up a lot in these things is the differentiation between what is caused by the protocol itself, what is caused by accidents of implementation, the way it is implemented making a difference, what is it caused, what parts of it are caused by use and misuse, and how do you start telling the difference between those? And so if we're talking about protocol considerations, what you think about when you're writing it, it really takes being able to differentiate those three different effects, and how do you do that? And so started to explore that issue in it. This is basically a report that I sort of intend to constantly update, sort of a rolling document, something that when somebody comes up to me and says, this Hrpc group, what are you doing? That it can give a general picture without diving too deep, and then can point to the others. Whereas on the research, there's an intent to publish it as, you know, a research group document, and then possibly an RFC at the end if it gets there, or when it gets there. This one, I don't really know where I really want to take it, other than to try and keep it up to date so that there's something that can be read, that can be useful to people. Maybe it turns into an article, maybe it turns into an RFC. I don't know, and I don't really have. Maybe parts of it get merged into the other document. So that's this document. I look forward to people reading it and commenting on it. I've already gotten some comments from Corinne. I've already, in fact, corrected a little bit of the stuff in the MD file where she told me I had her position wrong. So that's this document, and that's where it's at. Any questions? No questions. Okay. As I say, please read it. Please comment on it. Please tell me where I'm totally missing the boat on it. And if anybody, I only call myself the editor of this, by the way, because even though at this point I've written most of it, I've stolen words, I've stolen paragraphs, and I'm really hoping to get people to help contribute various chunks of it so that it really does end up sort of a compendium of the work and the thought that we're trying to have in this group. So thanks. And the next one is?
Yeah, so before we get too much into researchers telling each other they misinterpreted each other, because that can always go on for thanks very much, Avri, for presenting that. Avri is also going around with people who have not signed the blue sheet yet, and I see ready there in the corner of the Meet Echo screen, Joe Hall, and I'm going to try to hit the red button again and see if it works. Joe, can you speak?
I can speak.
Excellent, and we hear you. So it would be great if the Meet Echo people would enlarge you on, and it just happened. Perfect. Go ahead, Joe, with your presenting your censorship draft.
Sure. Do you have my slides up? It could just be a sync thing if they're there and I can't see them. I could just take your
coming up.
Cool. Sorry. So the sync works. For any of you who may have friends presenting remotely, tell them to turn off all your privacy software, because it can just be really difficult to figure out exactly what sauce makes it work. Anyway, so back to the task at hand. So I have 4 slides. I'll be pretty brief. So if you have been a co-traveler with us at HRPC, you've probably heard me talk about this once or twice. I presented at IETF 91 and SAG. This is a draft that I've been working on with a number of other folks commenting and a bunch of co-authors now. Feel free to click on it and read it just like everyone else. And I promise to read all the drafts here and get you comments, and I'd love to have comments as well myself. But the goal here, just to give you some context, if you haven't ever heard me talk about this, is at CDT we're hoping to have a series of documents. Hopefully they don't take 2.5 years a pop, even longer. Who knows? That provide sort of references for protocol authors. This first one is essentially a way to allow internet protocol engineers of various stripes to see how global sensors around the world are using their protocols against them, and hopefully to make decisions that would make protocols more robust against those kinds of efforts. So right now, and I should say, so a couple of people asked me explicitly to talk about how does this draft about censorship technology and censorship activities around the world, how does that relate to the newly minted RFC 7755? Go back one slide to the there you go. And so RFC, nope, I don't know what's going on with, maybe it's my browser. There we go. Stick on context for a sec. I'll say next slide. RFC 7754. So that is technical considerations for internet service blocking and filtering. I admire that draft a lot. It's took a long time to come. Essentially, that seems to be an audience for those that would filter or block or other kinds of entities in the internet ecosystem, and it's more about evaluating blocking and filtering mechanisms in terms of their alignment with sort of internet architecture, and specifically makes a recommendation that you should deal with these problems. These problems are best dealt at the endpoints, whereas this draft, the censorship draft, it's really for protocol engineers and to serve as a reference and to show what happens when people mess in the middle with some of these protocols and the weird things that can happen. Okay, now next slide. And I'm speaking really fast, I'm sorry. Maybe it's up. There we go. Okay. So just a brief recap. The 03 draft was essentially sort of an overhaul, and there's going to be another one, as I'll tell you on the next slide. But for this update, one of the things I've learned quickly is that you get a lot more authors, people potentially wanting to co-author with you, if it's not in IETF RFC XML. And so I refactored it all into Markdown. You should be able to pull from that GitHub address, and you should be able to build it and all that kind of stuff. If you don't, let me know, file an issue, and we'll fix it. One big thing is the structure is no longer prescription identification interference, and so that those are now it's prescription identification interference. The idea being prescription is deciding what you want to block. Identification is in real time figuring out if some flow is something that you would want to block or degrade or whatever. And interference is the actual task that some network person takes to actually degrade that traffic or block that traffic. We had it as aggregation, identification, and prevention, and for a lot of good reasons that didn't sit well, and so we sort of recast it. I dealt with a lot of comments from Stefan, and I'm not done yet with Stefan's comments. He's prolific and has a lot of really good advice. I also dealt with Martin Nilsson's comments. You can see those in GitHub issues and the pull requests that were implemented to make that work. We have a couple more co-authors now. Nick Feemster, who's now at Princeton, and his student Ben Jones are co-authors along with Mike Laren. Next slide. Okay, this is the last slide. So there's a bunch of open issues. Specifically, I want to try and get this going in the IETF process and hoping for potential AD sponsorship and to present whatever we get to by Berlin. And so there's a bunch of things that need to happen. There's some really great comments about restructuring this draft from Stefan and Nick Feimster. Stefan rightly pointed out that our DNS section was way too tiny. There's a bunch of really neat things. Now I'm talking about it as if it's fascinating. Whatever. There's a bunch of clever things DNS sensors can do that we're going to put in there. And Nick Feimster actually made the good suggestion. Why don't we just break this up into a layered structure, right? You know, where is something inspection or blocking happening in the network at what layer? That seems to be really powerful. Finally, Seamus Tui noted that he's been actually developing a bunch of attack patterns that include censorship. They don't all include just censorship, but these are being standardized for a different effort. And so I'm going to take a look at those and see if I can learn from those or contribute to those. But anyway, if you'd like to read it, we'd love your comments, especially, and this is, I'm opening myself up here, but big comments. You know, is this useful? Are you a protocol engineer in the room who has wanted a document like this to think about censorship? Are there things that are more important to you than censorship? Traffic analysis, other kinds of things, or the things, guidance that folks like us here can develop for you that might be helpful. Anyway, I'll shut up.
Thank you very much, Joe. Is there anyone who has any questions or comments on the draft or on Joe's presentation? No, so that's probably all clear. So that's probably going well for SAG in Berlin. Let's see how that will go.
Cool.
So thanks so much, Joe. So we'll go for the next issue in the agenda. And that's an open discussion. Oh, Nick is in the queue. Sorry. Nick, do we have you now on speaker? No, he should be there. Nick, can you speak?
Oh, yeah, speaking. That's right.
I see his little box. You could type it into the chat, Nick.
That's not using the whole new tool.
Sorry.
I'll push this button once more and see what happens.
Yeah.
Oh, so he wrote.
Joe Hal, by Nick. Do you have enough academics providing you feedback on the attacks you have seen?
Thank you, Olaf. So I'll answer that two ways. I think the first way is that there are some academics I'd love to rope in that I know more about this stuff, and I've been unsuccessful. I'm thinking of some of the Louvain folks in Europe. I know the Citizen Lab folks have seen this and are interested. We may cover all their stuff. But more importantly, the other answer to your question is, I would love to have some non-academics, as I feel like I approach this whole thing sort of as an academic. So the answer is not enough academics and almost maybe too much at the same time. It would be great to get people who actually have experience either with filtering and censorship tools, which I understand that might be a hard thing to come out and contribute for, or folks that have actual experience as network operators trying to make the bits flow around some of these techniques. Especially some of the more advanced things like protocol fingerprinting and stuff like that. Those could be pretty crazy cat and mouse games, and I'd love to know more. But anyway, the long answer, sorry. Oh, so wait 1 second. Listen, Nick actually asked a follow-up. He says, are you looking for new attacks? Do you have the attacks you need and the feedback on whether this is a useful presentation? So one thing I would say there is there's a tendency for the academics to talk about theoretical attacks we haven't actually seen in the field used against folks, and I'm kind of straying away from that. I mean, if there's a good cause to include ones that we might see that we haven't actually seen yet, that sounds fine too. I don't want to include ones that are sort of, yeah, we just made this up. It sounds like it's feasible. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Alyssa.
Okay, Cooper. We could try to find, sometimes it helps to get individual people signed up to commit to do a review, and it might be a little easier to do that like on a protocol by protocol basis. So to the extent that you have an application, I will admit that I read the draft 10 seconds ago, but to the extent that there's like application layer protocols, there might be specific people that you could rope in. Thinking of a gentleman, his last name is Nottingham, who left the room already, who might be willing to look at the HTTP bits of this. Obviously, you have people looking at the DNS bits, but sometimes that might be a useful way to break it up. So it's like you're not asking someone to do an entire review, but just get their eyes on the piece that they are most familiar with. And if you want application layer people, I'm happy to help with that.
Cool. That's a great suggestion. In fact, I'll add to your suggestion, say, I could say stupid things about people's protocols, and maybe that might incentivize them to contribute to fix them. But maybe that's a little disingenuous, because that's effectively what I did with DNS, and that's why Stefan was so mad at me for a while. But I think it's getting better. So anyway, thank you.
You know that no one reserves their opinion in the IETF, so
damn straight.
I'm sure that would happen here as well.
Thank you.
So with no more people in the physical nor in the virtual queue, we'll go on to the next point. Which, oh, and thank you, Joe, again, for answering the questions as well. There is space for open discussion, other drafts, papers, and ideas people would like to bring up.
Things that we should be doing? Nope.
Next steps, we also had a fair bit. So that leaves me to any other business. One thing is that we'll have a civil society friendly dinner tonight at the Green Life Vegetarian Vegan Restaurant after this session. So it's at Green Life Corrientes 1915 in Riobamba. I wouldn't do that from my pronunciation, just take it from the screen if you'd like to join. There is no host, but I'm sure we can split bill and have a nice dinner and discuss a bit more about similar issues and just have a nice evening. Another point is that we have organized together with the Asociación de Regos Civiles, which is a Argentinian digital rights organization, a screening of the film Net of Rights that was produced within the framework of this research group, together with the film The Computers, about the remarkable story of the 6 young women who programmed the world's first all-electronic programmable computer, the ENIAC, as part of a secret US World War II project, which was produced by Kathy Kleiman. We'll show that Thursday, April 7, from 6 to 8. So you could even be back in time for Bits and Bytes. So if you're interested, please join us there. And I think it would also be very interesting if we discuss with local civil society and exchange views and opinions. So that was all the 92 slides I had.
A quick comment on the movie The Computers. I saw an early version of it, and it really is quite a fine movie. It's really quite a good thing to see, and I want, you know, my grandmother, my daughter, just about everybody I know to see it. So it's really quite a good movie.
And I think also men should see it.
Yeah,
So with that, thank you all very much for your time and your participation. Hope to continue the discussion on the list and see you back in Berlin, and have a great meeting this week. Bye.
Thank you. The emotional content, though, is different. I think, especially for women in education. I mean, the women in STEM. It's very different.
We're going up, right?
So,